Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I have a very exciting video for you. I am super pleased to share with you my ocean main lesson block. Now this is a main lesson block that I created for our homeschool, and I wrote up all of the lessons. We did all of the chalk drawings and the watercoloring. I also have my son's main lesson book that he made throughout this whole unit study, and it's finally available for you. And so I'm going to walk you through all of these different lessons and give you some pointers on how you can use this main lesson block along with whatever curriculum you're currently using. All right, so it ended up being a lot thicker than I expected, even though this is only about a 4 to 6 week main lesson block. But the thing is that this includes a lot of photographs of the chalk drawings that I did to accompany each lesson, or the watercolors that I did for each lesson. It also includes my son's work, all of his main lesson book entries, the watercolors, as well as the narrations, and in some cases you might even find some of his rough drafts mixed in, as well as some images of the projects that you can do. I also have listed all the references and extra materials that we use in order to put together these lessons. And some of the books are ones that you can easily access at the library, and I think they make wonderful additions to that lesson. So let me walk you through this. This is a Waldorf inspired main lesson block on an ocean study, specifically geared towards California. So we're going to talk a lot about some of the things that you're going to find in the ocean in this area or in the tide pools, but we start out pretty global to begin with. First, I want to take you through what an actual main lesson block is and how you do a main lesson and how it differs from a unit study. So the first thing I want to say is that this could be used as a unit study or as a main lesson block. And the differences are pretty subtle at this point, but I still want to share them with you. For a unit study, you may try to include other resources in order to bring in other content to meet the needs of the other subjects that you're doing in your homeschool. So this is primarily a science main lesson block or a unit study. So you might want to try to find other resources to bring in math or history or literature. But it's kind of all contained in this main lesson block, so I don't think that you need to outsource too many other things in order to make this work. One note about a main lesson block that differs from a unit study is that when you're doing a main lesson block, the whole focus of that main lesson is with the content for that main lesson block. But at the same time, you're doing smaller lessons that are occurring on a daily basis. So you're going to have maybe 20 to 30 minutes of math every day. You might have some grammar review. You might have poetry, foreign language, music, and art kind of as part of your homeschool day. But the main lesson will be the focus of the morning lessons. All right, so for your opening activities as part of like a main lesson block, I've included some ideas and some examples. The opening activities are a great way to bring the students into the space of learning. And you can either do this at the very start of your homeschool day, or you can do this at the start of your main lesson. It depends on when you want to do your main lesson, whether it's the very first thing you do in your school or whether it's something that you do a little bit later on. For us, typically, our main lesson isn't the very first thing we do. We sort of have a slow start into our homeschool, and so we primarily begin with something that's a little bit more independent for my children. That may include some playtime together between my children. It may include some silent reading, and often these days it includes the math work that my children are going to do, and primarily it's the independent math work that they're going to do, and that way it gives us all kind of like a slow start to our school day. Once those smaller lessons have been taken care of, then we can dive into our main lesson block. Now, our main lessons rarely look the same from day to day. We tend to do things really differently depending on what day it is or what other activities we have going on in that day or how we're feeling or how prepared I am or what energy level we have. So I'm going to give you kind of an ideal look at what a main lesson block can look like, but bear in mind that this rarely happens day to day in our homeschool. So I love to begin our main lesson block with some opening activities. And the opening activities that I like best are two things: mental math and any kind of game that we can add to our main lesson block. Mental math is a great way to continue the math learning throughout the days and weeks and months of the school year without it being too heavy or too dry. So mental math for us usually involves a two-step equation, which the child will retain that in his or her mind and then answer the question. So I have some examples here for you of varying difficulty. I have a really simple one, which is 2 times 3 plus 9. So you might say 2 times 3 plus 9, and then you wait, and the child has to remember 2 times 3 plus 9 and has to work through 2 steps in the equation. So 2 times 3 is 6, plus 9 equals 15. You can get them to be a little bit more complicated. 1/3 plus 2/3 plus 6, and you get to 7. And you can use division, you can use decimals, you can use fractions, you can use all kinds of problems. The primary focus is to have it be a two-step equation and to have it something that the child can do mentally. We don't want to write this down, and you want to avoid questions that are too complicated where the child will have to ask you repeatedly what the question was. So this works for all grade levels. You can do this as simply as 1 plus 3 plus 2 for a really young child, or you can get more complicated for the older children. Some of the other games that I like to add to our morning activities are the Professor Noggins games. They're fabulous. They work really well with our main lesson blocks and unit studies. The only thing is that if you really don't know any information about the particular topic that you're going to study, the Professor Noggins games may not be the greatest choice for you for an opening activity because they are trivia based. But I find that as we work through our unit, those questions become easier because they're divided up into simple and challenging questions. You can work alongside with your child doing the more challenging questions if you're not if you're more familiar with the content, and if you're not, you can work through it together. Music, singing, and songs. I wish we did more singing in our homeschool, but if that is something that you already love to do or you have a skill at doing, then I highly encourage you to add that to your morning activities. You can make up your own songs, or you can go to the tried and true songs, and just having a little bit of that in the morning is a really great way to just prepare the students for something that's going to be mental. It's a great opening activity. Modeling clay. This is something fabulous for those kinesthetic learners, but it's also beneficial for all learners as well. You can use clay, you can use beeswax, and any kind of modeling that you do is going to be beneficial for the student, but if you happen to find something that coordinates with the main lesson block, all the better. Games, I talked about the Professor Noggins games, but you can also come up with your own games if you'd like for your opening activities. There are so many educational games out there. I encourage you to explore ones that are going to work for you. Physical exercise. There are some children who absolutely need this before they start school. When I used to hear about students who couldn't settle down until they were outside playing in the morning, I thought that that would not work for our students because once we start playing, we'll probably play the whole day. And so while being outdoors in the first thing in the morning doesn't work well for us, I found that other physical things in our home worked well because we could then transition into our homeschool day. So if you have the ability to go out, run around the block, do a nature walk first thing in the morning, you'll find that your students are mentally prepared for the school day. Their blood has gotten circulated, oxygen is flowing, and they're generally prepared to sit down and focus. If being outside isn't going to be an option for you, then I encourage you to try to do some of the things inside your home. Now, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can mix your mental math with some physical activity in the form of bean bags. So you can toss bean bags back and forth and practice your times tables.
3 is 1 times 3. 6 is 2 times 3. 9 is 3 times 3. 12 is 4 times 3. 15 is 5 times 3.
You can also use dowels and toss those back and forth to practice your math times tables, or you can practice your spelling list with something that is more active, maybe hopping or jumping. You can also bring in a 2x4 piece of wood or larger so that you can do some balance work. Balance work is so important for children and for adults. And walking along the balance beam can help center a child and also, again, prepare that student for the mental activities of the main lesson block. Spiritual studies. I don't want to overlook including spiritual studies into your curriculum. While this is not a religious curriculum, I find that adding spiritual content to any curriculum is going to be beneficial for the children. And you can do that in the form of verses or spiritual study. And in this case, with this main lesson block, we've included some verses within the opening activities of each of the main lessons in the form of poetry or even verses from different religious texts. Okay, so that kind of takes you through the whole idea of the beginning parts of a main lesson, but let's talk about the actual content, because we're going to be going through probably about 3 different sections of a main lesson block. The beginning part, the opening activities, this generally happens at the beginning of the main lesson block, but I have to admit that on some occasions we have started with our review work first, and then we've moved into our opening activities. So I just want to say that there isn't any right way or wrong way to do this. I encourage you to find what works well for you and your family. So following the opening activities, if that's what you're going to do first, I recommend doing some review work from the previous day's lesson. Now, if you're starting with lesson 1, there may not be review work for this particular main lesson block, but it's a great time to maybe recap the previous unit study that you did, or to recap any information that you have previously studied in your homeschool. If this is day 2, 3, 4, or the last day of your main lesson block, you're definitely going to have review work. Now, it's not just oral review of the content that you've done the previous day. It also includes work that you may not have finished. And so that might include any of the watercolors or drawings that you might need to do. It might also include some of the narration that still needs to be put into the main lesson book. Once the review is done, which could last maybe 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, it could be less as well, then it's a good opportunity to go into the new content. So it's a little bit interesting that the new content actually comes last in the main lesson, but considering that main lessons tend to be fairly long, it's a good thing that the new content comes at the end, because it's the exciting part of the main lesson because it's new. And if you do the new content right at the beginning, sometimes the students lose that energy and that motivation to go into the more difficult work of doing your review or polishing up your written narration or working on your drawing or watercoloring. So saving the new content for the end is kind of a way to re-energize that student at the end of a main lesson. Now, in a school setting, a main lesson will probably last about 2 hours, and it's all in one sitting. And that may work really well for you in your homeschool, but if it doesn't, don't worry. I know in my homeschool, we have so many interruptions that we're rarely sitting in one space for a 2-hour stretch. And granted, the opening activities may not include sitting, you may be moving around, but regardless, having a 2-hour stretch with no distractions in order to do a main lesson with one student or even multiple students that are within the similar grade range is not always feasible. So if you end up doing these in different parts throughout the day, I totally think that's okay. Now, with this main lesson block, I have included chalk drawings as well as watercolors. Now, we had a chalkboard, several chalkboards, in fact, in our homeschool, and we would do a chalk drawing pretty much every day for these lessons, and that is totally not necessary. You do not need to do multiple chalk drawings or multiple art projects for a main lesson. Since I did all of these chalk drawings and watercolors, you certainly can use them and your children, and you can copy them into your main lesson book, but don't feel like you're obligated to do every single one. Chalk drawings, if they're small, can maybe take about 30 minutes or less, but in a busy homeschool, many children, that may not be feasible. So it's totally suitable just to copy out of this book or out of any other resource that you want. I've included a number of resources at the end of each lesson that you can use in order to draw your own inspiration for art and narrations. All right, so once the opening activities are done, you may choose to do a chalk drawing with your student, and that student can then copy that into his or her main lesson book. Or you might have one chalk drawing to last the whole week or even the entire unit, and then you can do more simple drawings with your student, or your student can come up with his or her own drawings for the main lesson. Okay, following the chalk drawing, you have your review, which I talked about, and then you finally have your new content. For the curriculum that I've put together, I have written out the entire lesson so that it probably takes maybe 20 minutes at most to deliver the lesson, maybe less. Now, it's written in a way that you could read this aloud to your student, but if you want to keep in the Waldorf tradition, I would suggest that you read the content first and then present it as your own work orally to your student. I find that when I'm reading the work out of a main lesson book, it tends to go faster. I can read through it much more quickly than if I were presenting this orally. I find that once I get talking, I end up going on all kinds of tangents. My child and I end up talking, and we could end up doing a 45-minute main lesson introduction. And the time just goes so quickly, nobody even realizes that we've spent so much time on the actual content of the lesson. So you may do as you wish. You can also have your child read this to himself or to herself. But again, in keeping with the Waldorf methodology, you will want to read this ahead of time and present it. I have to admit that on more occasions than not, I was not prepared to deliver the lesson, and I ended up reading it out of the book or out of my own written work, and that's okay too. All right, so once that's complete, you may choose this time to discuss the content. When you're doing your narration, either oral, written, or in a form of a drawing, it does not have to be the same day. It's actually more valuable to save that review process for the following day. Regardless, each lesson is presented as a one-day lesson, but it is advisable that you spread these lessons out over multiple days so that you're doing part of the main lesson, the lesson 1 on one day, and then on day 2, when you're introducing lesson 2, you're now reviewing lesson number 1 in the form of a written narration or in the form of a drawing. So by day 2, you may have your child orally narrate back what they learned on lesson 1. Now, if you want to go further with that, if your child is older, you may want him or her to do a written narration. That's why a main lesson block or a unit study works really well with multiple ages, because you can ask your student to do work that is applicable for his or her grade level, but you can present work that can be for multiple grades. So the lesson itself can be for grades anywhere from 1 to 8, grades 1 through 8, but the content that the student is going to do now has to do with their grade level. So if a student is in first grade, she may not do as much writing or any writing at all versus a student who is in third grade or sixth grade. So bear in mind that the things that I'm going to show you as far as my son's work have to do with his grade level. So you can start with an oral narration and then move into a written narration. If you choose not to do a written narration and you'd rather do copy work or dictation, I have a suggested narration here for you so that you can either read this aloud and your child can write it down into his or her main lesson book, and you can also have your student copy this, which is really great if you're homeschooling multiple students and you don't have the time to either dictate the narration for your student, or if your student is too young to write his own or just doesn't feel like doing it because it's, several days or weeks into the main lesson block and they've just gotten tired of doing that. At least you have options when it comes to narration. For the watercoloring, the drawing, or the chalk drawing, this is definitely something that you're going to find in a Waldorf main lesson block, but it is certainly not necessary in order to get the benefits of doing a main lesson block or a unit study. I do highly encourage you to do the chalk drawings or the drawings with your children. But if you can't, I at least encourage you to have your children do an artistic representation of the lesson. Now, this could be something that they copy from this book, another book, or from your work, or it could be something that they come up with on their own. I've also listed the different materials that you may use or may want to use for your main lesson, as well as activities. There's not always going to be an activity with each lesson, but if you decide to do the activities with the lessons, bear in mind that each lesson is now going to take far longer than you expected. But also remember that if you're doing this as a main lesson block, then this is the focus of your day. So you may do something like this in the morning, and then in the afternoon, you may choose to do something that's more hands-on or more artistic, and that can continue the main lesson into the afternoon and have a different aspect to the main lesson. So for the very first lesson, I offer making a relief map so that you can get an idea of the content of the first lesson. I've also included the additional resources that I use in order to come up with the main lesson, and in some cases I have included picture books or activity books that can also complement the main lesson. I've also included a read aloud that you can either read aloud to your student for the entire duration of the main lesson block, or you can have your student read that to him or herself. You can find a number of books that will complement a history unit pretty easily. I find that ones complementing a science unit are a little bit harder to find, but I find that the books by Jules Verne seem to work really well. Okay, so I've got some examples of my students' narrations and his rough drafts. Then we're going to go on to lesson 2. And I'm not going to go through every single lesson, but I do include either a poem or a verse to start out each lesson. Now you can spend some time memorizing those poems or those verses, or you may choose to put that up on the chalkboard and have it be something that you just refer to throughout the day, or you may choose one for the week that you want to focus on and really spend time studying that particular poem or verse. So the lessons progress in a similar manner. Sometimes there are activities, sometimes there aren't. Sometimes we're doing things with watercolors and I still have a chalk drawing, like in this case. And sometimes we're both watercoloring together. Sometimes it's a crayon drawing or a color pencil drawing. Sometimes we're using watercolor pencils. I think that the point is that whatever art medium you're using, use something that you're going to enjoy and that the children can play around with and really get a feel for. So these aren't art lessons, these are artistic representations of a lesson. So you do not need to be an artist in order to do this. I typically need to copy other people's artwork or images from books in order to come up with these ideas. And so don't be afraid to do that as well. I think that you'll find that when you can copy something out of another resource, that your students see that whole process, that it's okay to do that, that you don't have to know everything in order to present it, that you can work alongside with your child. But I have to say one thing, that with pretty much every artistic representation I have ever done with my students, either in the form of a chalk drawing or a watercoloring or a color pencil drawing, my students have always been impressed with it and have always loved the work that I have produced, just as I have always loved the work that they produced. So you'll find that your students are the nicest critics of all, and that it's a joy to draw for them because they tend to be really excited about the things that you do, and being able to see that whole process from start to finish is really exciting for them. Okay, so we go through a variety of topics, and as you saw in the beginning, we started with some geology, then we moved into the explorers, and you could change out the content to fit the needs of your area. We started out with Sir Francis Drake, so that was a little bit of history mixed in with our science main lesson block, and it gave just a global view of what was going on at the time, and then how that explorer interacted with the environment. This may not be suitable for a really young student because the idea of a big planet and explorers in the time frame of hundreds of years ago may not be the right information for a young student. So in that way, the content is geared more towards upper elementary, where those ideas are a little bit easier to understand. But regardless, I have to say that I did this with students who varied in grade levels for about 4 to 5 years. And what I found with my younger student is that she got out of it what was important for her, and that my older student got out of it what was important for him at a higher level because he just has more background. And so I would not worry too much about the content if you've got younger children who are joining a main lesson block for an older student. However, if you are presenting this primarily for a younger student, then I would offer a suggestion of tailoring some of the content to be more suitable for a younger student. So it's usually always acceptable to bring up younger students into an older main lesson block and vice versa too. I found that my older students really like reviewing some of the things that they did when they were younger. Not always, but I find that some of the things that you think they're not going to be interested in, suddenly they are interested in. All right, so midway through the main lesson block, you'll find that there are some math lessons that are brought in here and some form drawing. Now you can bring math a lot more into the main lesson block if you wish, in the form of measurement, time, distance. You have a lot of opportunities if you want to bring that in. I did not bring in more math into the main lesson block other than the things related to geometry and the golden mean and things like that, and spirals, but you certainly could do that if you wanted to. Okay, let's move on to just the last couple of lessons in here. You can see that there is a lot of content in here. We wrote a lot, we drew a lot, and we talked about a lot. We also read a lot. At the end of each of the lessons, you'll find all of the resources that we used, as well as the read aloud books. And we really packed this main lesson block with a lot of information, with additional resources. So while I say this is a 4 to 6 week main lesson block, it really is more like an 8-week main lesson block because we added so much more to it. If you want to keep this nice and short and tidy, you certainly could do this in 4 weeks if you did 1 lesson a day. If you just read out of the book and did simple narrations and simple drawings, you could do this in 4 weeks. Okay, so we get to the end here where we're doing some other animals that are in our area that really are specific for the California and Southern California area in particular, as well as the tide pools. And so at this point in the main lesson block, you certainly could bring in some of the animals and plants that are local to your region if you live along the coast. And if you don't, then this main lesson block will certainly be valuable to talk about the California coast. All right, and at the very end, the very last lesson talks about salmon, and this is where we brought in a native Indian story, a legend about the salmon, and I have the information here that we used in order to put together the content for this lesson. And so while it is talking about the salmon, you also get an opportunity to talk about the indigenous people and their views on the land and the animals and how they interacted in their environment. And it was a really beautiful way to end the main lesson block by bringing it all the way back to something that's really beautiful and really honoring to the land and to the animals. Okay, so if you are interested in this main lesson block, you can find more information about it down in the description box below. At this point, I want to briefly show you my son's main lesson book. Now, you can buy main lesson books or you can make them on your own. Now, in this case, we decided to make it on our own because we had so many loose lessons and they were so many watercolors as well, that we decided that we didn't want to have one that was already pre-bound, because the ones that you will typically find are made with drawing paper, which is beautiful for doing color pencil drawings or just to do writing or even to do pencil drawings. But because we wanted to do so many watercolors for this, I decided to keep everything loose. And when we were done with the main lesson, we went ahead and bound it. The only problem that we had in doing this is that each lesson needed to be done front to back, because we didn't want to do it without just leaving it blank on the back. And so, and also because the written narration was done on drawing paper, whereas the watercoloring was done on watercolor paper. And so once we were done with a particular watercolor, we need to flip it over and do the next lesson on the back. Now, that takes a lot of planning, and there were some times that we made some mistakes within our main lesson book. Once you get the watercolor done on both sides, then you also have to pay attention to your written narration and make sure that each side coordinates with the next watercolor or drawing. So we did run into a bit of problem doing it this way, but I am really pleased with the way that it turned out, because I really wanted to do watercoloring with this main lesson block. Now, you can take your finished pages to a local office supply store and have it bound, just as we had this one bound with a clear cover in the front, a black cover in the back, and then plastic spirals on the side. However, I went ahead and I bound this at home using a home binding machine with metal coils, and you could do either, whatever suits you. But I do encourage you to bind your work at the end. The children love to see their finished work, and what's really great about doing a main lesson block with this much content that's original is that your children will love to look back at the work that they've done, and this is a natural review process for them. So all the work that they put into the main lesson block to begin with, which is a lot of work for a student, really pays in the end, not just for the sense of accomplishment that the student will have, but also for the educational opportunities that will follow in the months and even years when the student will review the work that he or she has done with longing and excitement, and of course, with education. I hope that this was helpful to you in both understanding how to put together a main lesson block, and also if you want to actually use this one. If you want to see some of the videos that are part of this Ocean main lesson block, you can tap on the screen right now. If you want more information about this curriculum, you can find it on my website at pepperandpine.com. And if you want to see how our homeschool is progressing on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram at pepperandpine.